The rain fell like a judgment, a cold, liquid curtain that turned the city's midnight glow into a smeared watercolor of neon and shadow. At a forgotten bus stop, where the cracked shelter offered little mercy, a small, elderly woman sat shivering, her thin silk blouse plastered to her fragile bones. Her name was Haun Kwan, but she didn't remember that. She didn't remember the grand house with its polished floors or the son whose empire was built on fear. She only knew the cold, the ceaseless drumming of water on the plexiglass, and the profound, terrifying sense of being lost. Rhea, her dark blue janitor's uniform dress soaked through, had seen her from across the street. It was past midnight, her shift at the Kwan mansion long over, and this was the last thing she needed. But something in the woman's vacant, terrified eyes snagged at her conscience. She crossed the street, the worn soles of her shoes splashing in the gutter. "Ma'am," she asked softly, her voice a small, warm thing against the storm's roar. "Are you all right?" The old woman looked up, her face a roadmap of confusion. "I'm waiting," she whispered, her Korean accent thick. He said to wait. Rhea knew who she was. She'd spent months silently polishing the floors around Mrs. Kwan, a ghost in her own son's house, a woman fading into the mists of dementia. She was meant to be in her suite, safe. Not here. Not in this deluge. Rhea pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling from the cold. There was only one number to call, a number given for emergencies only, a number that felt like holding a live grenade. Jinwoo Kwan. The man who owned everything, including the silence in his own home. The phone rang once, a sharp, electronic shriek, before he answered.
No greeting.
Just a low, dangerous hum of a voice. What? It wasn't a question. It was a demand for justification. Rhea's own voice was tight, strained. "Mr. Kwan." "It's Rhea." The janitor, eighth beat of silence, heavy with impatience. "I'm at the bus stop on Elm and Ninth." I found your mother." The silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a predator freezing, of a storm gathering force just over the horizon. "She's shaking in the rain. Helpless." Rhea added the last word because it was the truest thing she could say, a single word that painted the entire pathetic, tragic picture. The line went dead. Rhea didn't know if that was good or bad. She only knew that she was now standing in a storm, holding onto the hand of a forgotten queen, waiting for the king to come and reclaim his broken kingdom. The world held its breath, and the rain kept falling, washing the city clean of everything but fear. The headlights cut through the rain first, two blades of white light that sliced the darkness apart. A black sedan, so polished it seemed to repel the water, pulled up to the curb with impossible silence. The back door opened and Jinwoo Kwan stepped out. He didn't run. He moved with a lethal grace, the storm parting for him as if it recognized a greater, more terrible force. He wore a black suit, no umbrella, and the rain slicked his dark hair back from a face carved from granite and fury. His eyes, chips of obsidian, found his mother first, and for a fraction of a second, something other than rage flickered there. A deep, abyssal pain. Then his gaze snapped to Rhea, and the ice returned, colder than the rain. He didn't speak to her. He walked to his mother, knelt before her on the wet pavement, and spoke in low, gentle Korean. The words were a soft murmur against the storm, a language of ghosts and memory. He took off his suit jacket and wrapped it around her frail shoulders. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a whisper of his name. Jinwoo. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his movements economical and precise, and carried her to the car. Only then did he turn back to Rhea, who stood frozen, dripping onto the sidewalk. His driver, a mountain of a man, was already holding an umbrella over him. "Get in the car," Kwan commanded. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order that carried the weight of consequence. Rhea hesitated, her mind racing. This was a line she was never meant to cross. She was the help, invisible, silent. Now she was a witness to his vulnerability, a participant in his private disaster. "I can get a cab," she said, her voice small but firm. His eyes narrowed. That was not a request. You are a loose end. I do not leave loose ends to chance. You will come back to the mansion. You will wait, and you will not speak of this to anyone. Ever, the finality in his tone was absolute. He was a king securing his borders, and she had just stumbled into the heart of his territory. Swallowing her fear, she nodded and slid into the front seat of the sedan. The leather was cold, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken violence. As the car pulled away, she watched the city lights blur through the rain-streaked window, feeling like she hadn't been rescued from the storm, but had just driven straight into its eye. The mansion was no longer a workplace. It was a gilded cage, and its master had just locked the door behind her. The next few days were a lesson in controlled tension. Rhea was given a small but comfortable room in the staff wing, a place she had only ever cleaned, never occupied. Her janitorial duties were suspended. She was, as Kwon had stated, a loose end being managed. She was fed, housed, and watched. Always watched. Sometimes it was the silent driver, his eyes following her as she walked through the gardens. Other times it was Min-jun, Kwon's second-in-command, whose smile was as sharp and polished as the blade Rhea was certain he carried. He was all charisma and coiled danger, asking her questions that sounded like pleasantries but felt like interrogations. "You are very brave, Rhea," he'd said to her the day after the incident, his voice smooth as silk. To call the boss at that hour. Not many would dare. Rhea kept her answers short, her gaze lowered. She needed help, but she noticed things. The way Min-jun's smile never quite reached his eyes. The way a security guard flinched when he walked by. The hushed, urgent phone calls he'd take in the hallway, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. She also spent time with Mrs. Kwon. The old woman's doctor had confined her to her suite, and Rhea was one of the few faces she seemed to tolerate. She'd sit with her, sometimes just in silence, other times listening to fragmented stories about a childhood in a village Rhea couldn't pronounce. In those moments, Rhea saw the woman, not the liability. Kwon remained a distant, formidable presence. He would appear without warning, a ghost in his own home, observing her with his mother. He never thanked her. He never spoke of that night. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as if she were a puzzle he was slowly, methodically solving. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the staff area, she overheard two of the housekeepers talking in hushed Korean. She'd picked up a few phrases over the months. She caught the words for gate, security, and Min-jun's name, followed by a sharp, dismissive gesture. They were discussing how Mrs. Kwon could have possibly wandered off. The security on the estate was legendary. Gates, sensors, patrols. It was impossible for someone to get out unnoticed. Unless, Rhea thought with a sudden, chilling certainty, someone had let her out. Her mind immediately went to Min-jun, his predatory smile, his questions that felt like tests. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She was no longer just a witness to a family crisis. She was a piece on a board she didn't understand, in a game where the price for losing was undoubtedly fatal. The air in the mansion grew heavier, thick with unspoken suspicions. Rhea moved through the marble hallways like a phantom, her senses on high alert. She learned the rhythms of the house, the quiet hum of the security systems, the soft tread of the guards, the precise click of Kwon's dress shoes on the polished floors. She was a janitor by trade. Her entire professional life was built on being invisible, on noticing the details others overlooked. A scuff mark, a misplaced chair, a stain on the carpet. Now, she applied that same meticulous observation to the people around her. Her focus narrowed on Min-jun. He was Kwon's shadow, his most trusted lieutenant, but his loyalty felt like a performance. He was too eager, his deference too practiced. One evening, she was tasked with cleaning the library, a vast, two-story room lined with books that felt more like props than literature. From her position on a rolling ladder, dusting the high shelves, she saw Kwon and Min-jun enter, their voices low and intense. She froze, hidden by the shadows and the towering spines of leather-bound classics. "The Viper shipments are moving through the port tomorrow night," Min-jun was saying. "My sources confirm it." It's the perfect time to strike. Kwon stood by the massive fireplace, his back to her, a silhouette of immense power. Your sources have been wrong before, this time is different, Minjun insisted, a sharp edge to his tone. We can cripple him. Kwon turned slightly, and the firelight caught the cold glint in his eyes. Or we can walk into a trap. The viper is not a fool. He anticipates aggression. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, and for a heart-stopping second, Rhea thought he'd seen her. But his eyes passed over her hiding spot. Patience, Minyoon. A lion does not waste his strength chasing hyenas. He waits for them to expose their throats. The conversation shifted to logistics, coded language, and locations she didn't understand. But it was the tension between them that struck her, the subtle friction of a subordinate pushing too hard against a master who demanded absolute control. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rhea wandered toward the solarium. The glass walls revealed a garden bathed in moonlight, a peaceful scene that felt like a lie. And there she heard it again. Minjun's voice, a low hiss from the adjoining corridor, this time on the phone. She pressed her ear to the wall. The old lion is cautious, he was saying. He hesitates. But his caution is a weakness. We will proceed as planned. Make sure the package is ready. A chill traced its way down Rhea's spine. The old lion. He was talking about Kwon. This wasn't about rivalry. This was betrayal. This was a coup brewing in the heart of the kingdom, and she was the only one who had stumbled upon the treason. A week later, the storm inside the mansion finally broke. Rhea found Mrs. Kwon in her suite, sitting by the window, a rare moment of lucidity gracing her features. The old woman turned as Rhea entered, her eyes clear and focused. She patted the seat beside her. Sit, she said in halting English. Rhea complied, her heart aching at the fleeting clarity. Mrs. Kwon reached out and took Rhea's hand, her own as fragile as a bird's wing. You have kind eyes, she murmured, her gaze distant. Like a girl I knew long ago. She was not afraid of the thunder. She began to speak of her son, not the formidable Mafia boss, but of Jinwoo, the boy who would hide under the table during thunderstorms, the boy who once brought her a fistful of wilting wildflowers because he thought they were beautiful. He built these walls so high, she whispered, her eyes clouding over again with the fog of her illness. To keep the thunder out. But I think he trapped it inside with him. The moment of connection was shattered when Kwon appeared in the doorway, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He saw their joined hands, and his face hardened into a mask of suspicion. What are you doing? He demanded, his voice low and cold. She was just talking, Rhea said, gently pulling her hand away. Leave us. He didn't look at Rhea. He looked at his mother, whose brief lucidity had vanished, her eyes once again lost and confused. After Rhea had slipped out of the room, she waited in the hallway, her heart pounding. A few minutes later, Kwon emerged, his shoulders slumped with a weariness she had never seen on him before. He finally looked at her, his defenses momentarily down, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded grief. He leaned against the wall, the king without his crown, just a son watching his mother disappear. She doesn't remember my name most days, he said, his voice rough, devoid of its usual authority. But she remembers the boy who is afraid of storms. He looked directly at Rhea, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at a janitor or a liability. He was looking at another person. That night at the bus stop. You didn't call me with fear. You called with pity. She was cold, Rhea replied simply. And alone. Anyone would have done the same. He gave a short, humorless laugh. No. They wouldn't. In my world, they would have seen her as leverage. A weakness to be exploited. He pushed off the wall, the mask of command settling back into place, but the crack had been exposed. She is all I have left of me, he stated, the words a quiet confession in the silent, opulent hallway. The part that remembers wildflowers instead of blood, and in that moment of shared vulnerability, Rhea knew she couldn't remain silent about Minjun. His betrayal wasn't just a threat to a crime lord, it was a threat to the broken boy who is still afraid of the thunder. Armed with a terrible resolve, Rhea sought out Kwon. She found him in his office, a cavernous room of dark wood and glass that overlooked the entire city. He was standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. He looked every bit the king surveying his domain. Her courage almost failed her. This was the man whose name was a whisper of fear on the streets, and she was about to accuse his most trusted man of treason. "Mr. Kwon," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn. "I am busy. It's about Min-jun," she said, forcing the words out. "I need to tell you something that got his attention." He turned slowly, his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Speak," she took a deep breath. "I heard him. On the phone. He called you the old lion. He said you were hesitant, and that they should proceed as planned." Before Kwon could process her words, before the accusation could fully land, the world exploded. The armored glass of the window behind him spiderwebbed, and then imploded inwards, a deafening roar swallowing the room. Gunfire erupted from the hallway, the sharp, staccato rhythm of automatic weapons. Men loyal to Min-jun stormed the office. In the chaos, Min-jun himself appeared in the doorway, a cruel smirk on his face, a pistol in his hand. "He's right, old man," Min-jun sneered, his voice cutting through the din. "Your caution has become a weakness." "The Viper sends his regards." Kwon moved with blinding speed, shoving Rhea to the floor behind his massive desk just as a spray of bullets tore through the air where she had been standing. He drew his own weapon, a sleek, black pistol that seemed an extension of his hand. "You let her out," Kwon growled, his voice a low rumble of pure fury as he returned fire. "That night, my mother." "It was you." Min-jun's laughter was manic, unhinged. "Of course, it was me. I was hoping she'd wander into traffic or get picked up by the Viper's men.
Un tragique accident.
Or better yet, leverage to make you kneel. But your little cleaning lady ruined my plan." The betrayal was absolute, more venomous than Rhea could have imagined. Min-jun hadn't just betrayed his boss. He had used the most vulnerable person in the house as a pawn, a disposable piece in his bloody game of chess. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of violence in the confined space. Kwon was a master of his craft, a dancer of death, but he was outnumbered. The king was being overthrown in his own throne room. The office was a war zone of splintered wood, shattered glass, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Kwon moved like a phantom between overturned furniture, a deadly wraith in a tailored suit. But for every one of Min-jun's men he took down, two more seemed to appear. Rhea huddled behind the heavy oak desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a janitor. She cleaned up messes. She didn't survive gunfights. But watching Kwon fight, seeing the raw, protective fury in his eyes as he shielded her, sparked something within her. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Min-jun had used Mrs. Kwon. He had tried to kill them both. This was personal. She remembered her cleaning cart, abandoned just outside the office door when the shooting started. On it, a spray bottle of industrial-grade ammonia concentrate. Her mind raced. The air vents. The office had its own closed ventilation system, the intake grill low on the wall near the door. While Kwon pinned down two gunmen near the window, Rhea crawled, keeping her body flat against the expensive rug. Bullets whizzed over her head, embedding themselves in the wall with sickening thuds. She reached the hallway, her hand closing around the cool plastic of the spray bottle. Min-jun was advancing on Kwon's position, using a large armchair as cover, shouting orders. "He's alone. Finish him." Kwon was reloading, trapped. It was now or never. Scrambling to the vent, Rhea twisted the nozzle to a fine mist and emptied half the bottle directly into the intake. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the ammonia vapor, colorless and potent, began to pour from the ceiling vents. It hit Min-jun's men first. Their eyes started to water, then burn. They choked, coughing violently, their aim faltering. The sudden, invisible attack threw them into confusion. Min-jun spun around, his face contorted in rage, trying to understand what was happening. He saw Rhea by the vent, the bottle in her hand, and his eyes widened in disbelief and fury. "You!" he screamed, raising his pistol. But the distraction was all Kwon needed. He surged from behind the desk, no longer on the defensive. He moved through the choking, disoriented gunman like a blade through silk. He disarmed one, broke the arm of another. His focus was singular, absolute. He was coming for Min-jun. In that moment, the power dynamic of Rhea's world was irrevocably shattered. She wasn't the help. She wasn't a witness. In the heart of the storm, the quiet janitor had just learned how to make thunder. The fight culminated in a primal, vicious confrontation between Kwon and Min-jun. With his men incapacitated, Min-jun was cornered. He abandoned his firearm and drew a long, wicked-looking knife. Kwon met him empty-handed, the two of them circling each other in the hazy, chemical-filled air of the ruined office. It was a brutal ballet of violence. Kwon was stronger, more precise, but Min-jun was fueled by a desperate, rabid fury. They crashed against the walls, their grunts of effort and pain replacing the sound of gunfire. Rhea watched, horrified but unable to look away. Kwon gained the upper hand, landing a series of punishing blows that sent Min-jun staggering back. He had him, disarmed and beaten. But as Kwon moved in to finish it, Min-jun made one last, treacherous move. He lunged, not with the knife he'd lost, but with a smaller, concealed blade from his boot, plunging it deep into Kwon's side. A strangled gasp escaped Kwon's lips. His body went rigid with shock and pain. Min-jun grinned triumphantly, a bloody, broken smile. It was the last thing he ever did. With a roar of pure, untempered rage, Kwon drove his fist into Min-jun's throat, a single, devastating blow that ended the fight and Min-jun's life, instantly. The traitor crumpled to the floor. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. Then Kwon staggered, his hand flying to the wound in his side, his face pale. Dark blood bloomed through the fine fabric of his white shirt, a fatal rose. He collapsed to his knees, then fell to the floor, the great king brought low in his own conquered castle. Rhea rushed to his side, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Jin-woo. She used his name for the first time, the sound of it strange and intimate in the carnage. His eyes were glassy with pain, his breathing shallow. The wound was deep, bleeding profusely. His loyal men were now securing the mansion, but medical help would take minutes he didn't have. Her mind went back to a first aid course she'd taken years ago. Pressure. She had to apply pressure. Tearing a strip of fabric from the curtains, she balled it up and pressed it hard against the wound. Kwon flinched, a low groan rumbling in his chest. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. "You are not allowed to die. Do you hear me?" He looked at her, his focus wavering. His hand, slick with his own blood, found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. He tried to speak, his voice a ragged whisper. "The wildflowers," he breathed, his eyes drifting shut. "Tell her. I remember." He was delirious, lost in the fever of his injury, confessing his deepest truths to the one person who had seen past the monster. In that moment, holding him, trying to keep his life from spilling onto the floor, Rhea felt the last of her fear for him die, replaced by a fierce, terrifying, and overwhelming devotion. Weeks bled into a month. Kwon survived. The blade had missed any major organs, but the blood loss had been severe. He spent time in the mansion's private medical wing, a place Rhea hadn't known existed. During his recovery, the dynamic between them shifted completely. She was no longer a prisoner or an employee. She was a fixture at his bedside. At first, he was resistant, the proud king refusing to show weakness. But she was unyielding. She would read to him when the medication made his vision blur, or simply sit in silence, her presence a quiet anchor in his world of pain and paranoia. He began to talk. Not about his business, but about the boy who was afraid of storms. He told her about building an empire to protect the one person he loved, only to become a monster she no longer recognized. In turn, Rhea spoke of her own life, a simple life of hard work and quiet dreams, a world away from his. In that sterile white room, they were not a mafia boss and a janitor. They were just Jinwoo and Rhea, two survivors of a storm, mapping out each other's scars. The threat of the Viper, the rival who had backed Minjun's coup, still loomed. His organization saw Kwan's injury as a sign of weakness, a chance to devour his territory. Kwan's lieutenants urged him to rest, to let them handle it. But Kwan knew that a king who did not defend his own throne would soon have no throne to defend. The day he was finally cleared by his doctors, he called a meeting of his most loyal men. Rhea was there, standing not behind him, but beside him. He outlined his plan, a swift, ruthless, and final assault on the Viper's entire network. It was not a war. It was an extermination. When one of his captains suggested Rhea be taken to a safe house, Kwan's response was swift and cold.
She stays.
She is safer with me than anywhere else in the world. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the same view from his ruined office, now perfectly repaired, he turned to her. There was no ring, no bended knee. His proposal was as intense and uncompromising as he was. This world is violent, he said, his voice low. It is built on fear and blood. I cannot offer you peace. I can only offer you my strength, my loyalty, my entire kingdom. He took her hand. They call me a king, Rhea. But a king is a hollow thing without his queen. Marry me. Stand with me. And I will burn the world down to keep you safe. She didn't hesitate. She looked into the eyes of the man who was both a monster and a protector, a storm and a shelter, and saw her future. Yes, she whispered. 1 year later, the city glittered below them, a carpet of diamonds thrown across black velvet. Rhea stood on the penthouse balcony, the cool night air a soft caress against her skin. She was no longer in a dark blue janitor's uniform. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk that shimmered in the moonlight, a queen in her castle in the sky. The scars on the city from Kwan's war with the Viper had healed, just as the scar on his side had faded to a pale, silvery line. He had been true to his word. He had not started a war. He had ended one, dismantling his rival's empire with surgical precision until nothing but dust and whispers remained. The name Kwan was now spoken with more reverence, more fear, than ever before. But here, in their sanctuary, he was not the king. He was just Jinwoo. He came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He no longer moved with the silent tread of a predator, but with the familiar comfort of a husband. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "The rain," she answered honestly. "I was thinking about the night we met." The storm, he turned her in his arms, his dark eyes soft, all the ice and fury melted away by a year of devotion. "That storm," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "It was the end of my world. And the beginning of my life." He kissed her then, a kiss that spoke of brutal fights and quiet healing, of shared nightmares and peaceful dawns. Downstairs, in her suite, his mother slept soundly. Her good days were fewer now, but on them, she would look at Rhea and smile, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes as she called her daughter. Rhea had found her place not as a servant in a dangerous world, but as the unshakable center of it. She had walked into a storm and found the one thing she never expected, a love as fierce and powerful as a hurricane, a love that had calmed the thunder inside the king. They stood together, two impossible souls forged into one by violence and vulnerability, masters of the glittering, dangerous city that lay at their feet. They had faced down betrayal, assassins, and ghosts of the past. What challenges could possibly lie ahead for a partnership so absolute? And if you were in her shoes, standing beside a man of such immense, dangerous power, would you feel safe, or would you forever be waiting for the next storm to break? The answer, like their love, is not simple. It is a beautiful, terrifying thing.